exposure to the things that you don't
Güzel
want to be
Petra.
exposed to is
Huh?
curative if it's voluntary. That's a big deal. And it has to be voluntary. It can't be involuntary because that'll just make it worse. Because you might ask, well, you know, if a kid has a fear of rats or mice, they got that fear because often they were exposed to rats or mice, and then you use exposure to rats and mice to cure them. Well, that makes the precipitator of the illness the cure, which makes no sense. Well, what's the distinction? Well, it's one thing to have something pop up at you when you're not expecting it. That puts you in a state of apprehension and preparation for action, in a state of, even a state of terror, a state of reflexive shock, and then perhaps terror, and maybe something you don't recover from. That's completely different than facing something voluntarily. The psychophysiology isn't even the same. So if you're faced with a stressor of a certain magnitude and it's involuntary, your body produces a lot of the stress hormone cortisol. And in large doses, cortisol is toxic, especially if it's produced over long periods of time. But if you face it voluntarily, then that doesn't happen. You use a completely different set of circuits to do something voluntarily. And it's the utilization of the voluntary circuits that indicates your mastery over the thing that you're afraid of. And that mastery over the thing that you're afraid of and can't cope with, that actually constitutes your adaptive personality. And so part of what the existentialists were suggesting is that precisely, and you see this in Freud with his insistence that you go into your messy past and dig up the corpses and the skeletons and sort them out, and Jung's insistence that what you want most is to be found where you least want to look, and Roger's insistence that people communicate honestly about difficult things. It's all predicated on the same idea, in some sense, that voluntary exposure is one of the prime things that cures people. And one of the things that you should think about, you think, well, is that a valid claim? Well, you have the psychophysiological evidence, but it's also the case that that is how people learn, right? If you're a child and you're learning to master the world, you actually exist in a state of existential anxiety unless you're near someone that will take care of you. So for example, if you take the typical child and you go to a mall, say a 3-year-old, and then you have the 3-year-old stand and you leave, it isn't going to be very long till you're far enough away so that most children in that situation will immediately start to cry. They're worried they'll start to cry, and then they'll break down. Well, because that's the existential anxiety. Like you think, well, a normal child is calm. It's like, wrong. A normal child close to someone who can take care of them is calm. But that is by no means the same thing. It's not even close to the same thing. And so it gets backwards in your psychological thinking if you don't notice that, because you think, well, the normal human being is calm and well put together. It's like, no, wrong. The normal human being in a place of safety is calm and well put together. But why you would ever think that a normal place is a place of safety, you know, assuming that that's the standard or the norm, there's absolutely no reason for that. You see this with rats too, because the behaviorists, for example, made the presumption that you had to teach rats to be afraid. Let me tell you how that actually worked. It's really interesting, and it shows you how carefully you have to analyze, say, psychological experiments to understand what's going on. So let's say you take a lab rat, okay, and let's say it's a lab rat that, like a rat that Skinner, famous of the behaviorists, and he could get rats to do anything. He taught pigeons to play ping pong. He taught pigeons to guided missiles by photographs, and he did that with behavioral training. They were never used for guided missiles because the electronics working before the program was set into operation. But he could get them to peck at photos to guide something that was flying accurately, and he did that with behavioral training. So Skinner, I mean, he was no joke. He really knew how to train animals, and it's very useful to know, to some degree, if you want to train children, for example, or pets. So, because the learning mechanisms are very similar, which is why, of course, we can get along with pets, right? We understand them like we understand children, roughly speaking. So, anyways, so let's say you've got your rat, and he's sitting there, and he's pretty calm, and he's in his cage, and so he's already a weird rat, because he's been genetically altered. He's not a wild Norway rat, so he's a little tamer than a normal rat. Maybe he's a little more fearful, although perhaps not. And he's also a solitary rat in his cage, and there's no such thing as a solitary rat. It's like a solitary zebra or a solitary carp, carp. Cod. Cod exist in huge schools. There's no such thing as a cod. which is why they will never come back, as far as I know. Once you wipe out the school, you wipe out a beehive, and they have 6 bees. What the hell is this doing with 6 bees? What are they going to do? They don't exist on their own. And bird animals are like that too, and frogs like that. They organize their mating behavior in their huge schools. So without the school, what the hell is a cod going to do? Nothing. And that is what they do. But anyways, back to the rat. So you've got this rat, he's in a cage, he's alone, and he's hungry, because one of the things that Skinner did was starve his rats down to 75% of their normal body weight so that they would respond a lot more to food. So that's the model, and that you got to keep in mind the nature of the model. The model is the way the model is constituted is equivalent to your implicit assumptions about your experiment. Okay, so the rat's calm. So then what you do is you take the rat out of his cage and you put him in the testing chamber. And so maybe what you're going to do is you're going to set the rat up so that a light goes on and then he gets a little electric shock. Okay, but teach him to be afraid of the light. So I'll compare the light with the shock 6 or 7 times. When the light goes on, the rat's going to freeze. So, and he freezes because he's using predator avoidance basically to deal with the threat. But, and so you think, well, calm rat learns to be afraid. But no, because when you put the rat in the cage, the new cage, what does it do?
Aj ljebe, dragi, hoćeš li ga prekinuti vrata, pusti vrata na miru.
That's the normal rat. It's the one that's like this. It doesn't move, because if it moved, maybe a predator would pick it out, like a cat, because cats can see lateral movement. That's why they have slit eyes, by the way, so they can detect lateral movement. And you know that because you play with your cat like this, it'll chase your hand, but if you do this, it won't. It's because it doesn't chase things that do this. It doesn't chase kangaroos. It chases things that move like this, so it has eyes for that. Anyways, the rat's frozen, and then it starts to sniff, because a rat is all smell. The brains of most animals are organized around smell. Human beings are very big, because our brains are organized around vision. But that's just not the case for most, well, you know, dogs. They're the weirdest things, because they can smell like way better than you. They can detect odors way better than you. Probably most of them smell better than a dog. But they can detect odors better than you. But everything seems to smell good to a dog, which is the strangest damn thing. You know, with a nose like that, you'd think they'd never even want to go outside. But anyway. Now I probably lost my place. All right, dog, smell. Where will we go? Rat. Yes. What's that? Frozen, yes, okay, so the rat, that's the one. That's the one. So the rat is in its cage, and it's frozen so that nothing can see it and eat it. And so it starts to sniff, because it uses smell to see what's going on. And so if you take rats that have never been exposed to a cat, and blow cat odor over them, they do not like that at all. They do not like cat odor. So it's built right into, it's an archetype. The predator cat is an archetype for the rat. And it doesn't need any pre-training to respond to it. And it's probably also the case with human beings and things like snakes and looming objects. We've got some archetypal predators as well. But, all right, so the rat sniffs, and then if nothing happens, it thinks, okay, a rat can sniff here without dying. And so then it starts to relax a little bit, and maybe it starts to move around a bit, and then it thinks, okay, a sniffing rat that's moving a little bit can live here without dying. And then nothing else happens, and so it relaxes a bit more, and then it starts to sniff its way around, and it'll sniff all around the cage and check out all the corners and make sure that there isn't anything there that can eat it, because the rat actually cares about that. And then when it's completely explored the cage and decided that it's safe, then it turns into a normal, calm rat. But that's post-exploration. So you have to say, well, a rat that has thoroughly explored its territory is a calm rat.
Šta je to, nisi završio tamo?
Kud se penješ gore? Gdje? Nasprat.
Gdje nasprat?
Na ovu kuću.
Ne znam, je li ima gore, šta je još jedna kutija ili nema je?
A nema.
Ma nema, balanjera.
It learned that it was safe and it was wrong. And that's a really important thing to understand also about what we're like. Because you know, like anxiety, that needs no explanation. Depression, that needs no explanation. What needs explanation is how the hell do you ever feel secure and together ever? Because that's the mystery. And partly the way you do that is by never going anywhere where you're upset. You stay in your territory. And so, like, this is your territory. Everyone knows how to act here, right? So you look around, everyone's sitting and doing exactly the same thing, so you can ignore them. You can pretend that they're not dangerous. And most of the time, that will be correct. And some of the time, it won't be. And so you maintain your emotional stability by staying where you belong. And that's quite different than the psychoanalyst view. Psychoanalyst views, you know, that you're in commonwealth together if your psyche is properly organized. It's like, this is partly why I introduced you guys to Piaget, because Piaget adds this other element. You know, he says something like,
Čim je
yeah,
misli
well,
ubrla?
your psyche has to be organized. You have to turn everything that is a constituent
Šta je
element
ovdje
of
ima
you
još?
into a
Gdje je
functional
zombi?
being. But that being has to be integrated in a functional game-like landscape. made of
Joj,
other
šta je
people
ovo
doing the
pojela
same thing.
mistiku?
And then the concordance between your structure and that
Debilana
landscape
moja mala ne zna da prođe ovamo.
That's a way different theory. It's a much more sophisticated theory. So you could say, in some sense, the psychoanalysts had it half right. You know, and also be individually pathological in a way that doesn't let you fit into society. But you have to understand the concordance between
Joj,
the
ćeš
social
mi ti
organization
prekinuti.
and the individual organization to get the picture right. Well, so what do the existentialists say? Well, it's something like, in the depths of your existential terror, the wisdom to cope with that terror will be found. So that's the fundamental idea. And then there's a more profound idea in that, which I would also say is implicit in psychotherapy. The more behavioral, the more implicit it is. But the idea is that despite the fact that you are mismatched, that you're outmatched by, let's call it existential complexity, there's something in you that's far more complex than you know. And if you challenge it, it will respond by growing and developing, and that will
Znači,
not
boš.
protect you against the existential anxiety. It's not like a shield or a guard that you're hiding behind. It's not a defense. What happens instead is that you actually learn how to deal with it. You know, so you think about it this way. One of the things that human beings are archetypally
Nemoj,
related to is
kako,
fire.
zbog čega se prekineš, Bog te mazo, jebote, bagovano govno, znači šta ste popravili crnog đavla?
When we mastered fire, which may have been 2 million years ago, something like that, it looks like from then we learned how to cook, which made a big difference. So, you know how chimps, I haven't told you the chimp story, I don't think. You know how chimps are sort of shaped like this? They've got this huge barrel-shaped body. Well, yeah, they spend like 12 hours a day chewing leaves.
I gdje si našao liko, Bog te mazo?
You go out in the forest.
Pitam ovo, Tuljan mrt.
Gdje je našao tuljan mrtvi?
Leaves aren't edible. They hardly have any nourishment at all. And so if you're a chimp, all you do is sit around and chew leaves. And then you need to have an intestinal tract that's wrapped 2 or 3 times around this room so that you can digest the damn things, right? So that's chimp life. Well, human beings, we decided to trade
Kaže neko
intestinal
drugi
length
ga
for
ona
brain.
i
And the way we did that was by learning how to cook. And we mastered fire. And so you might say, well, is fire dangerous? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on how you react to it. It's exactly that, right? You say, well, fire is intrinsically dangerous. It's like, no, fire is multivalent. It has all sorts of possibilities. And some of them are extraordinarily destructive. But if you match your behavior properly to the phenomena, then you can master something like fire.
Kenturis
So
fu.
the idea is that there's a
Aha,
potential
daj ovo me.
inside you, whatever inside means, there's a potential that's part of
Završimo
you.
još
Some
ove
of it's
3
genetic
građevine, 4
potential.
građevine
We know
i onda
that
idemo
because if we move you into a new environment,
nazad.
new genes will turn on inside of you and manufacture new parts of you. So if you stress yourself optimally, if you push yourself out into the world, you can incorporate information from that journey, the exploration. That's a Piagetian
A odakle si ti
idea, right?
pojavi?
You go out, you learn something new, and you adjust your behavior to it, you adjust your concepts to it, and then you can master it. But what Piaget didn't realize was that it also transforms your biological structure at a microscopic level merely as a consequence of being put in the new situation. So the idea is that there's more to you than you know, and the way you call it out is by challenging yourself voluntarily in as many directions as you can manage. And that's a real thing. It isn't the construction of defenses. It's not something artificial like defense against death anxiety. It's actually how you learn to cope in the world. And the existentialists, I would say, despite exceptional pessimism, were in some sense unbelievably optimistic, because what they would say, it's the opposite of a strong man. So how weak are human beings? Ultimately weak. We're up against an opponent, so to speak.
Sino, bo on sve
Pa
pisti.
Bog te zabagovani, jebem ti zabagovano govno. Po vama, evo kutija, ako možeš pokupiti, znači... Zabaguje, samo nemam pojma, znači, pritisnem čekam svoje da odradi i ne može. Ništa, idemo praznice onda.
So it's so interesting that it's a good example of how if you face what you're afraid of, you can find what you need. You say, well, the existentialists make the strongest case possible for the vulnerability of human
dobio
beings.
sam ljubičasti
And
robotik.
out of that, they extract out the strongest case possible why human beings are strong and powerful. It's a very interesting paradox. And again, I would say that that's central to psychotherapy. One of the things that's been learned about agoraphobics, for example, agoraphobics, they're usually women, they're usually in their 40s, they've usually been dependent. Often someone close to them has divorced or died, or they're having heart palpitations or something like that, sometimes as a consequence of menopause. And they've accustomed themselves to seeking authority when challenged. But the problem with having heart palpitations is like...
Da vidiš to su svijetli ovo čudeso ovdje. Mystic love.
Most agoraphobics have been to the emergency room like a dozen times because they have heart palpitations, and then they feel them, then they get afraid and panic, then their heart rate goes way up, and then they think, oh my God, I'm going to die, and while I die, I'm going to make an absolute fool of myself, and everyone's going to laugh at me. So that's social rejection and biological mortality staring them right in the face. Well, so then you take an agoraphobic and
Samo da vidim šta je staro.
Ma idi ti samo dođi za mnom kad vidiš.
And then you start to expose that person to the things that she's afraid of. Elevators, maybe, subways, taxis. Actually, agoraphobics, really, what happens is they're not really so much afraid of places or things. What they're afraid of is being trapped in a place or a situation where they can't get away, and then if they had a heart attack, they wouldn't be able to get to an emergency ward. So that's really at the basis of the fear. And the emergency ward thing only helps to a limited degree, because if you're having a heart attack, and it's a really good one, you're dead. And so that's a place where recourse to authority is only going to take you so far, right? So it's not a good solution to the problem. Well, so what do? Well, you expose the person maybe to an elevator, and maybe the elevator is there, and you tell them, well, we can get on an elevator, and they say no. So, well, can you look at an elevator? Well, I don't think so. Well, how about some pictures of an elevator? So you show them some pictures of an elevator on Google, and maybe one with closed doors and one with open doors. You have them look at the damn thing, because they won't want to look away. But you can't look away. You have to investigate it. And then what your brain learns is that you're afraid of that thing, but you can scan it with your eyes, and nothing happens. It's like the rat in the cage, sniffing and realizing, well, he can sniff and he doesn't die. It's like you can look at the picture of an elevator and you don't die. So do that when you're bored. And then you've learned that you can look at that elevator without dying. It's built right into you. Well, then maybe I can take you out and we'll look at a real elevator. So I say, well, let's walk as close to that elevator as you can manage. I want you right on the edge between order and chaos, let's say. I want you to find that edge. Can you stand here? Yes. How about here? Yes. How about, that's good enough. Okay. You're standing here. Order, chaos. That's where you're at. So what happens? You stand there and you notice you don't die. And you do that long enough so you're bored with it. And then you think, well, can you step 3 feet closer? Yes, you can. Well, and maybe after 3 weeks, you say, well, we're by the door, so here's the deal. I'm going to open that door, and I'm going to hold it open, and I'm not going to play a trick on you. And so what you're going to do is just poke your head in and take a look around. And so imagine doing that. Okay, so you imagine. Okay, now actually do it. Then I don't let go of the door. That's what evil psychotherapists do. Anyway, then you get the person inside, and what you see is they're looking at their shoes. they're in there, but they're not really in there. You say, no, you gotta look. You gotta look in the corner, you gotta look at the numbers, you gotta see that you're in this thing that you're afraid of. So you have to look around, look around. You're like the rat coming, relaxing, starting to move. So that's good enough. Get out of the elevator, slowly. Don't rush out. Go out calmly. Good enough. Go home, sleep for a week, and then come back and we'll do it again. And if you do that for, depends on how fast the person is capable of advancing, but you can move people through phobias pretty fast if they trust you, and they have to trust you, and you have to be careful. You say to them, look, we will stop doing this whenever you want, as soon as you say so. So this is completely up to you. I'm not pushing you. I've got no demands on you. You want to be able to go outside again, we're going to walk through that, but you're not performing for me. This isn't a test, this isn't a contest, it's none of that. And when you're done, we're done. And you can also help people like step through that. So I was treating somebody with egophobia recently, and this person really felt trapped by authority figures that were medical. And and so the first thing I did, because we were working with this needle, was say, you're going to practice getting the hell out of here. So I'll come at you. I'll come at you with this needle. I don't have a needle, but with the hand I do. So I'm going to move it towards you, and you're going to tell me to stop, and you're going to leave the room because you want to see that you can.
To je to sum.
Like, no, you don't know.
Ma treći je šaban, znači sa mašinkom ide.
Like a kid pretending. So I needle, and they say stop, and I stop, and they say I'm leaving, and they leave. And they come back smiling. They didn't know they could do that. And part of them is still thinking, well, I'm a 4-year-old kid, and there's no way I can get out of here. No one's going to listen to me. It's built right into them. That's like Freudian regression or fixation at an earlier developmental stage. And if you watch for that in people, sometimes you can see how old they are. If you tap into something that they were afraid of very young,
već je čovjek očistio sve. Ništa velika kuća iza. Trčamo ko će brže počistiti sve. 11 zombija. 10.
And then she can go take taxis, go in the subway, and then she goes and has a big fight with her husband, because she should have had one 20 years ago, but she was dependent and authority-seeking, so she never would risk it, because if she had such a relationship with authority, then it would expose her to the world. And so she was always in a subordinate and inferior position, and a bit of a slave. And one of the things that often happens when you treat someone with agoraphobia is they get a lot more assertive. And you think, well, one of the things the psychoanalysts objected to when the behaviorists started to use exposure was the idea that there would be substitution, because the psychoanalysts would say, you're not really afraid of an elevator. So if I just treat your elevator fear, because that's really not what you're afraid of, the fear is just going to pop up somewhere else. That'd be substitution. But that isn't what happened. What happened was that if they learned to get on the elevator, they're much more likely to take a taxi. You think, well, why is that? It's because they weren't learning that things were less frightening. That was the original idea. The original idea was conditioning. That basically the person had been conditioned to be afraid of whatever it was, and then what you did was you put them in encounter with that, and you let them breathe and relax, and then the relaxation they learned would counteract the panic, and that's why exposure therapy worked. But it turned out you didn't need to do any of that. It wasn't counter-conditioning at all.
A ništa, ako nema tu, pa idemo dok dođeš na drugu stranu, možeš sve odradiš i onda nastavimo na drugu stranu.
You poke him, he goes into a shell, and then he comes out again. Poke. It's how you tease a snail, if you ever need to know that. So he comes out, you tap him, and you do that 10 or 15 times. The snail gets bored. You tap him, he just sits there. Now he doesn't get bored because snails are probably always bored. But what's happened is that in some sense, you've exhausted the nervous system representation. That's one way of thinking about it. Or you can think about it as a very simple form of learning. That's habituation. You learn to ignore. And the idea then for a while was that you were teaching people to habituate to these things they were afraid of. But that also turned out not to be true. What you're actually doing is teaching the person to be brave. And that generalizes. So they think they're all pathetic and fear-ridden and tiny and vulnerable and useless.
Da se odbaguješ.
Like that, and then you say, well, look, this is a horrible
Tas.
thing you've got here.
Tas,
Why don't you
escape
see
I
if you
tas.
can manage it? And so they go through it and they think, wow, I could do that. Ha! I'm not as
За
useless
free.
as I thought. And then
Да.
maybe they try 20 things like that and they think, wow, I'm a lot tougher than I knew I was. Maybe they stand up a little bit straighter because they're a little more dominant and their serotonin systems start to
Ma
work
kak je
again.
ovo zabava?
And then they're ready to take on the world more. And maybe that's why they don't have
Ma
fight
kak
with
je?
their stupid husband.
Ništa.
And that doesn't necessarily make them very happy either. And that would be an example of psychotherapeutic resistance from a family member. Do you really want your person to be better? Right? If they're a little more assertive and a little less fearful, you might not be able to tyrannize them so easily. And so it's not necessarily the case at all that you would be happy about that. So you got to watch that sort of thing too. And maybe the person wouldn't even be that happy about it because they're getting all sort of secondary benefits from
Sad
being,
ćeš onaj Alt
neurotic
F4
and
izaći.
martyred, because that's a vicious weapon. To be weak and useless, if you
Ma
can
ne-
wield that as a weapon, it's
Jesi odbagovo
extraordinarily
ili šta?
effective. So you got to watch
Man-
for that sort of thing to be working against your psychotherapeutic aims as well. Like psychoanalysis, existentialism seeks to utilize these very conflicts as avenues to the more profound self-understanding of man. In many ways, existentialism is the unique and specific portrayal of the psychological predicament of contemporary man.
Party member has left.
That relates back to the idea that
You have left the party.
modern people have been stripped of their archaic belief systems and exposed more completely to the possibility of a meaningless and painful existence with no subordinate meaning. Existentialism is not a school of thought nor reducible to any set of tenets. The three writers who appear invariably on every list of existentialists, Jaspers, Heidegger, and Sartre, are not in agreement on the sentence. Such alleged precursors as Pascal and Kierkegaard differ by being dedicated Christians, and Pascal was a Catholic of sorts, while Kierkegaard was a Protestant's Protestant. If, as often done, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are included in the fold, then we must make room for an impassioned anti-Christian, Nietzsche, and an even more fanatical Greek Orthodox Russian imperialist. That's a little hard on Dostoevsky, I would say, but by the time we consider adding Rilke, Kafka, Ortega, and Camus, it becomes plain that one essential feature shared by all these men is their perfervid individualism. Also, that's another element of existentialism. The locale of action is individualism. The idea is that, well, you're fated in some sense to suffer and to be vulnerable as an individual. And so the right unit of analysis for people is as individuals.
Slušao?
And again, I would say that's a primary tenet of psychotherapy.
Ne.
There are family psychotherapy schools, for example, but individual psychotherapy is predicated on the idea that the individual is the right level of analysis, the correct level of analysis.
To je Twilight Holitore.
Committed. To give you an interesting example of this, one of the things that you guys are going to do is you're going to do the personality analysis.
Pa puni prije, odmah kad je prazno, automatski se puni.
If you did master meaning, you would also do the future authoring exercise.
Nego kad ja hoću da pricnem da pokupim inventor i onda hoćeš da se puniš pušku. Jebem ti, sunce ti, jebem. Debilno.
In the business school at the Rotterdam School of Management, we've tested
Gdje je ovaj
put
jedan?
about 4,000 students through this future authoring program. That helps you make a plan for 3 to 5 years. Plan and a counter plan. The plan is what you want to have happen, and the counter plan is what you
Vamos.
really do not want to have happen. And then you make a plan to avoid the latter and to move towards the former. And
Stran.
we compared their performance.
S koje strane nama, prelijevo, desno?
performance to the performance
lijevo.
3 years before that. So it wasn't a perfect design, although we also did a controlled study that had the same.
Ignorište mene.
So when we started, before we started having people do this plan, here was the ranking of performance. So we looked at ethnicity and gender. So the top performing people were Dutch national women. And they were a minority among the business students and probably a fairly selected minority. So maybe that's what accounted for their higher performance. Although women tend to be underperforming.
Misli, dođi vamo sunce, jel ti jebem?
All the way from elementary school to university, which is an absolute catastrophe, but we won't talk about that now. So, and then the next highest performing group were Dutch nationals, and then the next highest performing group were non-Western ethnic minority women, and the lowest performing group were non-Western
Ma samo pozovi me,
ethnic minority
pritisneš,
men.
pozoveš me u
And there were quite a few
partiji i
people in
vidiš
those
me gdje
categories,
sam
so it
bolan.
wasn't just even a
Vraćam
couple
se
dozen, it was a
nazad,
couple
evo.
hundred. Solid study. And within 2 years after
Onako.
doing the future authoring program, the non-Western ethnic minority men were outperforming the Dutch women. Their academic performance went up 70%, and their dropout rate plummeted. And it really looks good for decreasing dropout rate. And the reason I'm telling you about that is because people make the automatic assumption that ethnic disparities in ethnic
Penena da je
performance
desna
is
strana
necessarily
nije.
a consequence of sociological
Šta je desna
inequality,
strana?
let's say, or sociological or
Znam te nama, kada otvoriš map,
economic,
tako je.
disparity. Let's
Sad sam
say.
na
This
centru,
was a
kažem
pure
ti, vraćam se
psychological
nazad.
intervention. It wiped
Da,
out
bio
their
si desno. Ja
and the
sam
Dutch
otišao
women
lijevo.
had actually improved
Ne, bio
slightly
sam
over
lijevo.
that 2-year period as a consequence of doing the program as
Bio
well.
sam ja lijevo.
So the men not only caught up
Gdje
to
ti auto?
the way they were performing,
Auto?
but the way
Ja.
they were performing
Nemam ja
even better
pojma gdje mi je auto. Auto mi je kod onoga gore. Brutusa, nisam ga ni povratio nazad.
Ček, imam poziv.
Zebe, dragi, samo neki pozivi, neko te uznemirava.
I think it's associated with disagreeableness. Now, we don't know that for sure because we haven't been able to disentangle that, but it's been a very striking finding. So,
Evo.
anyway, so you can say, well, what's the right level of analysis when you're trying to improve human adaptation? It's a terrible word, but
Ja, ovamo točkica, znači tuču se ljudi.
it'll do for now because I can't think of another one. So,
Et, moram i...
Gdje ćeš bolan, sad ću kafa?
any school of thought, the
A?
repudiation of the
Gdje
adequacy
ideš?
of any body of beliefs.
Odo s rocom da me časti kavom.
A evo te kava, znači, da časti pivom, znači roštiljom, nečim konkretnim.
To se kaže kao.
Ma zebam se, znači, samo...
Ima ovi stariji da ne čuju.
Ništa, lagano samo.
A najlaganiji.
It's really useful to have a body of view about what might be up and how you might address the problem. And to have a full array of psychotherapeutic tools, so those criteria discussed, opens up your...
Ništa, ako dođeš ponovo, ako dođeš danas, nastavljamo. Ako ne dođeš danas, nastavljamo kad dođeš.
Now, sometimes that's useful.
A dođi posle.
They've got no structure at all. If you approach them as if the problems were Freudian, at least it's systematic. And they can come out with a systematic understanding of their problem. And it might match to some degree. If you're having all sorts of anxiety and depression problems, we could probably look into your family history and identify reasons why that might be at least partly the case. And so that's at least a reasonable, maybe there's multiple reasons, but at least nailing one of them would be useful, more useful than nailing none of them. So, but what's better is to treat the person as someone you don't know. You have no idea what's up with them, but you have a bunch of potential tools to use, and then you talk to them, and you treat them as if they're unique. And you figure out what is up with them specifically, and they tell you what's up with them. You know, they've got all sorts of cockeyed theories about who they are and what they're doing, and it's scattered and paradoxical, and it doesn't make much sense, and it's like a bad undergraduate essay, roughly speaking. It's full, well, really, it's full of
Gdje ideš gore, Bog te mazo?
But if you listen long enough,
Sad ima boss. 20 do 5.
starts to pull themselves
Da.
together with their
A, jebe,
reputation,
dra.
and they start to act that out.
A koga jebe, neću ništa puno propustiti.
Ma te balan, ko da jebeš bossa, čuvaj zdravlje, balan. Bolje na kafu otići.
Ja. Ništa, ne čućemo se.
The other
Ajde.
thing, the existentialists, they're kind of romantic. I would say. The romantics are thinkers who deny the overarching supremacy of rationality and the intellect. They would say that to think about life as a problem that is to be solved rationally is insufficient because you're not a rational being, or you're only partly a rational being. You're also an emotional being, and you're a motivated being, and you're an embodied being, and that's a lot different than being purely rational. And I would say there's actually not even debate about that anymore. It's pretty damn clear that rationality cannot really operate unless it's embodied, so it has a set of operations that it can undertake. That it's motivated, so that there's certain things it's doing and other things that it isn't. That it's emotional, because emotions are low resolution, quick solutions to problems that can't be computed. So for example, we get in an argument and we just can't go anywhere. And at some point you say, well, to hell with you, I'm going home. You're angry. That's right. Do you win? Well, no, but you don't have to have the stupid argument anymore. So the anger is actually, it's a way of popping you out of a rational framework that there's no escape. You just say, well, this is stupid, and you leave. It's like, there's nothing rational about that, except that you don't want to stand there and argue till you starve to death. So you need the emotions to give you guides in situations that you can't really compute your way through. So, and only inside of that does rationality operate, with all of those underlying predicates. And the rationality has to be informed by the body and by the motivations and by the emotions for it to even operate. So the existentialists are correct about that. To deny rationality as the fundamental principle of orientation doesn't mean that irrationality is the right approach. It means that rationality has to be augmented by other elements of being, elements of subjective being. And that's akin to the psychoanalytic viewpoint too, that you have to integrate your drives and emotions, especially anger and sexuality, into your personality, and also akin to Piaget's idea that the sub-personalities, the reflexes and so forth, have to be, have to be organized into a playable game so that everything is working in harmony. So it's a similar idea. Now, the existentialists regard the division between object and subject as part of what specifically tortures people who are outside of, say, traditional systems of belief. Because, and this is a tricky one, scientists might claim that, well, the world is material and matter is essentially dead and without spirit or psyche. And it's easy, as a consequence of adopting that viewpoint, to think the same thing about you, that you're ultimately a short-lived material entity in a meaningless material world. But the weird thing about that, and this is worth thinking about, is that if you're a scientist, you throw away this objection as soon as you start operating in science. Because the idea is, well, you'll watch something according to a procedure, and you'll watch it, and you'll watch it, and you'll watch it, and we're only going to allow what all of you experience the same way to be real. Well, you throw out the subject, and then so you can't say, well, there's no subject left in what results. It's the reason there's nothing left in what results is because you threw it out to begin with. Now, the question is, what should you do with it? When the existentialists say, well, you're alive. You can't just dispense with it. The fact that you're alive is the critical issue. And so you can use science as a tool, proper. But if you use it as a way of describing being, well, then you fall into this subject-object dichotomy, and underneath that is nihilism or proclivity for totalitarianism. So they don't like that idea. They don't like the idea of compartmentalization either. So we won't go into that to any great degree. Okay, now I'm going to read things I've been collecting. All right. So this is Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and I call them the prophets of the dawning age. Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and writer, was really the first person who wrote about phenomena like anxiety, dread. So he was the first person who sort of conceptualized it even as something akin to a scientific phenomena, something that had existence, and he wrote very much about that. Nietzsche, of course, was the great prophet of the death of God, and a prognosticator of what the psychological consequences of the demise of this classic meaning structure that was unbelievably ancient, what the collapse of that actually meant. I mean, you can think about Christianity, and then maybe you could think about the Judaism that it was embedded in as even an older system. But that Judaism emerged out of the Middle East, partly out of Egypt, which was enmeshed in even an older belief system, and that was enmeshed in something absolutely prehistoric. And so it was a continuum in some sense of adaptive structures that reigned supreme essentially right until the scientific revolution. And so we're outside of that now. We're in a different paradigm, and there are consequences to that. And that was the sort of thing that Nietzsche was concentrating on. And he actually in some ways made it worse, because Nietzsche was an incredible critic of Christianity. I mean, he wrote a book called The Antichrist, and all he did in that book brilliantly was take dogmatic Christianity to task. Now, one of the things he did say, which is very interesting, was that Christianity died at its own hand. So his notion was that because Christianity, say Judeo-Christianity, had elevated truth to the highest virtue, that search for truth then ended up undermining the axioms of Christianity itself. So it developed a tool, an unbelievably powerful analytic tool, and then used it to, well, it's like we were sitting on a branch and sawed it off with the saw that we had invented, and then everyone fell. And Dostoevsky, well, Dostoevsky was an Orthodox Christian, but also an extraordinarily brilliant man, and he was absolutely terrified at what the consequences of the dissolution of that belief system was going to mean for Russia in particular. And Dostoevsky explored nihilism to great degree in Notes from Underground and in Crime and Punishment, because the murderer in Crime and Punishment is essentially nihilistic. He's a nihilistic narcissist, roughly speaking, and that's what compels him to commit murder. But Dostoevsky also wrote a book called The Devils, which is an amazing book, where he predicted that the sudden death of Christianity in Russia was going to produce the catastrophic totalitarian horrors of the Soviet Union. And he predicted that in like 1880, 1890, which was 30 years before the revolution. Absolutely remarkable. Nietzsche, a genius. Nietzsche was a full professor when that was impossible, I think when he was 24. And that just never happened. And so his extraordinary genius was recognized very early. But he was also extraordinarily ill, sick, physically. His dad died at about 40 of something they called softening of the brain, which was actually a fairly common diagnostic category back then. No one really knows what it was. Some people have suggested that he had syphilis from one sexual encounter, or that it was hereditary, but nobody really knows. But anyways, his father died young, and Nietzsche died very young as well. He was mentally incapacitated for the last few years of his life, and died after that. And so he could only serve as a professor for a while because he couldn't see very well, and he was always sick. And he ended up living in this little village, I believe in Switzerland, where he wrote his books, and he could only write a paragraph or two at a time before he became very ill. And so his writing is extraordinarily condensed and dense and brilliant. And I think he gave away, Beyond Good and Evil, which is his masterpiece, although he had many. I think it only sold 500 copies in his lifetime. So he also believed that he was only writing for himself. He didn't really know if anybody was ever going to pay any attention to what he said, but they certainly did. So I would say he ended up being certainly one of the 10 most influential people of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is an example of his writing. Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically, and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently. The advent of nihilism. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that's afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has conversely done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Sorry about that. Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value those values really had. We require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door, whence comes this uncanniest of all guests. Point of departure. This is a good example of how Nietzsche said he philosophized with a hammer. And it means that he spent hours, days, weeks, months concentrating on how to make a single sentence as packed with significance as he could possibly manage. And so Nietzsche said, it's the best arrogant statement I've ever read. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people a whole book to say. And then he said, what they can't say in a whole book. That's pretty good, eh? It's like the first one's a real like blow to the solar plexus, and the second one is like I can top that with no problem. Point of departure: it is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or the corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. That's a critique of the later Freudian ideas right there and then, because what Nietzsche says was, look, if things are going wrong for you, or if they're going wrong in general, it's really straightforward to say that, well, there's something wrong with society, that would be social distress, or there's some physiological degeneration, there's something wrong with you physically, or everything is just corrupted, being itself is corrupt, which is a classic explanation, right? You hear that all the time. You think, well, people are suffering for one reason or another. Well, why? Well, there's something wrong biologically, or society is corrupted and everything is unfair. Nietzsche says, no, you're not going to get away with that. First, he says, ours is the most honest and compassionate age, comparing modern civilization, let's say, to everything that has come before it. So speaking of corruption is not something you can do lightly. And then he says, and this is remarkable, distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Well, that's a rough one. It's like, well, you had a rough childhood. Well, someone else who had your childhood might not have drawn those conclusions. So here's an example. You know that most people who abuse children were abused by as children, right? But most people who were abused as children do not grow up to abuse children. And you can figure that out arithmetically, because if it was the case that everyone abused grew up to abuse, in about 4 generations everyone would be being beat to death in childhood as a matter of course, because it would spread exponentially. That isn't what happens. It dampens. And why is that? Well, if you're bullied as a child, we could say, well, you could draw 2 conclusions, causal conclusions. Being bullied caused me to be a bully. Fair enough, man, that's an understandable story. How about being bullied caused me not ever to be a bully? Well, why is that any less reasonable a conclusion? It's frequently one that people draw, and since the 2 opposite conclusions can be drawn from the same set of experiences, you cannot say that the experiences caused the conclusions. And that's Nietzsche's critique of, say, sociological or psychological determinism with regards to the optimism or pessimism of your worldview. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Right. Rather, it is in one particular interpretation, the Christian moral one, that nihilism is rooted. The end of Christianity, at the hands of its own morality, that was the development of the sense of truth, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness, highly developed by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. A remarkable claim. And then this one's even worse. It's absolutely brilliant, I think. Rebound from God is truth to the fanatical faith, all is false. That's nihilism, an act of Buddhism. And Nietzsche explains that. And this is, you know, I talked to you guys a little bit about the idea of the game and the metagame, you know, the metagame being the set of all games. Nietzsche draws on a conception like that for this criticism, because he says when you lose faith in something, and that happens to people very frequently, when you lose faith in something, because you're human and because you can abstract, it's not only that you lose faith in that thing, that person, that system. The fact that you've lost faith in that indicates to you that it's possible to lose faith in anything, in every system, in every person. Once burnt, forever shy. And that's nihilism. The fact that one thing can collapse on you can make you completely unwilling to manifest any faith in anything whatsoever. And that's the emergence of nihilism. The end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it has tried to escape into beyond, leads to nihilism. Another critique of Christianity embedded in that sentence, he said, well, Christianity needed to be destroyed even by itself because it put so much emphasis on the afterworld, on heaven, that it forgot completely about life now and here. And because of that, needed to be destroyed, because life here is sufficiently rife with suffering, so it needs to be addressed. And people, it's wrong, it's incorrect to inform people that they should wait for some hereafter and justify their suffering in that manner. And so he would say, in some sense, that even the idea of compassion, which is central to Christianity, is also one of the reasons why Christianity collapsed under its own weight. The untenability of one interpretation of the world upon which a tremendous amount of energy has been lavished awakens the suspicion that all interpretations of the world are false. Well, so what? You might say, well, so what if you don't believe in anything? Well, I would take a neuropsychological approach to that. Most of the positive emotions, dopaminergic. It's a consequence of the manifestation of the exploratory system that has its roots in the hypothalamus, a very ancient part of the brain. It's the same part of the brain that cocaine and heroin, all the drugs that people like to abuse, the drugs that are exciting, not the drugs that are calming, it activates that system. It's the system that's activated when something exciting happens to you or when something novel happens to you. But more importantly, it's the system that's activated when you're pursuing a goal and you see that you're moving towards the goal. So what does that mean? No goal, no positive emotion. So you say, well, if you have nothing to believe in, if you have no value structure left, because a value structure says this is better than this, no value structure, no positive emotion. Well, and so what's the problem with that? It's easy to get rid of your positive emotion. That's not a problem because it's rather fragile and tenuous. Try getting rid of your negative emotion. Good luck. That is not going to happen. So what happens is that if your value system collapses, then all you're left with is negative emotion. And that is not a good thing. Well, so Nietzsche would say, well, why do people flee into the arms of totalitarians from the specter of nihilism? It's because totalitarian certainty, even though it involves slavery and the sacrifice of reason and intellect, totalitarian certainty might be preferable to nihilistic chaos. Well, it's a big problem. And he said, well, I'm telling the story of the next 200 years. It's like, well, ever since then, for the entire 20th century, we bounced between nihilism and totalitarianism with deaths on both sides, constant, and we're still doing exactly the same thing. Dostoevsky was a big influence on Nietzsche, and it's very interesting to read them in parallel because Dostoevsky is of course a dramatist and Nietzsche is a philosopher, and it's almost as if Dostoevsky wrote the drama and Nietzsche provided the philosophical commentary. They're very, very powerful to read together. This is from Notes from Underground. It's a very short book about this character who is a bureaucrat, nasty sort of bureaucrat. He knows he's a nasty sort of bureaucrat. All he does, he spends his whole life trying to make life more miserable for people because he's so resentful and crushed and weak. And so he just did nothing but abuse his bureaucratic position and used his trivial bit of power to lord it over people. He gets a little bit of an inheritance and quits. And this is his confession, Notes from Underground. He's the underground man. It's a brilliant book. It's viciously funny, and it's so psychologically alive. If you're interested in psychology, it's a spectacular book. And it's only about 100 pages long. Anyways, he's arrogant and nihilistic and resentful. And what he does is he tries to justify his life to himself and does a very poor job of it, even though he's trying to be honest. There's a lot of honesty in it. At one point, he meets a woman who's been forced out onto the streets because there weren't very many options for women in the Victorian period who had fallen afoul of economic necessity, and he basically, in a fit of false messianism, offers to save her, which he can't because he's completely useless. He can't save himself even, but he offers to save her, and she more or less accepts. And then when she shows up, having sacrificed a tremendous amount to do so, he basically tells her that he was toiling and makes her situation far worse. Because you see, he repents and he says what he's like. He's a horrible person. He's weak and resentful. And then he confesses, and then he says, well, now I've confessed. I'm a better person. Then he tries to do something good, but he hasn't changed his life a bit. Not a bit. The confession was just to make himself feel better. And so he offers to help someone who's contemplated right under the water where they drown. It's an amazing book. And this is from Underground. In short, when they say anything about the history of the world, anything that might get the only thing one can't say is that it's rational. The very word sticks in one's throat. It's a good example of the existential criticism of the idea of rationality. Operate according to rational principles. But let's think about history, especially from the perspective of a thinking and feeling being. History is a may. And indeed, this is the ordinary that is continually happening. There are continually turning up in life moral and rational persons, sages and lovers of humanity who make it their object to live all their lives as morally and rationally as possible. So to be, so to speak, a light to their neighbors, simply in order to show them that it is possible to live morally and rationally in this world. And yet we all know that those very people sooner or later have been false to themselves, playing some queer trick, often a most unseemly one. Now I ask you, what can be expected of man since he is a being endowed with such strange qualities? This is a criticism of utopianism. That's what he's trying to do, right? Because the utopian ideas were starting to emerge in Russia at about this point.